listening to The Party Line, a podcast from The Ditch on theditch.com. I'm Harry Browne.
And I'm Niamh Bhriain, and you can follow The Party Line wherever you watch or listen to podcasts, or follow The Ditch on all your apps. You can like and subscribe. So today we're joined by Roman Shortall from The Ditch. Hi, Roman.
How are you?
Welcome, Roman. Yeah, we've got a relatively small number of people on the panel. We've got a huge agenda today. We're going to be concentrating on Irish militarization, the Irish weapons industry in the context, of course, of wider European militarization, and about how all of this is making our dangerous and uncertain world even more dangerous and uncertain. We're also going to be talking quite a bit about what we've been seeing here and elsewhere in terms of direct resistance to that program of militarization. First on the agenda, and relevant to that, is our regular check-in with what's in the ditch.
Yeah, so Roman, there's two stories that you were going to talk about today, both of them related to direct action. So the first is to do with the Ullum 5 and Germany, so maybe you can talk a little bit about that first.
Yeah, so basically there's a number of people in Germany. One of them is an Irish citizen, Daniel Tatlow-Devilly, who allegedly broke into the Elbit Systems factory in Germany, in Ulm, and allegedly caused some damage. Their trial started in the past couple of weeks. Their trial is happening in a high security court complex that was used to prosecute members of Baader Meinhof in the 1970s. It's a very unusual setup. It's not your typical courtroom. They're coming in behind glass, and they are, I guess, being treated like very dangerous criminals, despite the fact that the allegations against them are, relatively mild in terms of the actual actions that were allegedly taken.
Right, but it's their belonging allegedly to a prescribed organization that sort of drives it into this area of almost the terrorism spectacle.
Yeah, and we've seen it in the UK as well, where we've had young women like in their 20s who have been held in custody for months and months, again accused of, the actual substantive allegations relate to just, minor criminal damage, but they're being kept in prison for months on end. When clearly there's no real justification to keep them in prison.
No bail.
No bail, and the reason that they're not being given bail is because their actions allegedly relate to what's going on in Gaza.
Right.
So you have like a lot of, and similarly in Germany, a lot of political pressure behind the scenes to treat these people like very dangerous.
And so in Germany, not only no bail, not only this kind of Baader Meinhof spectacle in the courtroom, but also 23-hour lockup.
Yep.
Letters take a month to get through to them. They're when they meet with their families, it's through a computer screen. From what I understand, Daniel Tatlow-Devilly's father, Conor Devilly, was on RTE a couple of weeks ago talking about these conditions and about his serious concern about the capacity for a fair trial here. And a serious thing for Conor Devilly to be saying. He is a senior counsel, and he is observing this about the German legal system. Conor Devilly, as it happened, was one of the barristers in the Pit Stop Plowshares cases relating to action at Shannon Airport back in the early 2000s. He was actually on the prosecution side, but was a very fair and a very brilliant barrister, even though he was on the other side of that case from most of us. And it's quite poignant to see him now in this context.
Yeah, and I mean it's kind of kicked off, like, aside from the conditions that they've been facing, like the conditions that they've been facing in court at the start of the trial, where their lawyers said that they had difficulty taking instructions from their clients, which kind of shocking to hear, like from one of the bigger countries in the European Union. and lawyers are saying like that they can't effectively communicate with their clients.
And the ditch, of course, also has revealed that the factory, the facility that they attacked, was an Elbit Deutschland facility, was directly involved in shipping important weapon systems to its Israeli partner that were used in the genocide.
Yeah, so I mean the factory is located, as I said, like in a place called Ulm in Germany. That's the Elbit Deutschland factory. And of course, as we know, Elbit Systems is an Israeli weapons maker. It supplies, I think, 80 or 85% of the IDF's land defense requirements, weaponry, and so on. So they are like the largest supplier of weapons overall to the IDF. They also supply other countries. I think we've reported on some of it as well. But they are making target acquisition systems in this place in Germany. And at the time that this alleged action took place, which I think it was in August or September last year, there was no, I think, documentary evidence tying Elbit Deutschland to Elbit Israel in terms of the export of military goods. But the ditch then reported that it had got its hands on some records which showed exactly what was being shipped from Germany to Israel. And those items were target acquisition systems. And what those are, they're basically what it says in the tin. They're to put a target on people's backs. They've been used to target civilians in Gaza. They're laser target acquisition systems, and they might not be actual weapons that fire bullets, but those are the things that are used to make the Israeli killing machine more efficient.
Yeah, so maybe Roman, tell us then about the other case that ye had reported on. So it's to do with Palestine Action Era and targeting Accra Control in Dublin. Maybe you can tell us about that as well.
Yeah, so Accra Control is a defence company based in Clonskee, Dundrum kind of area in Dublin. And they're kind of like a smallish company that kind of just fly under the radar, but they were acquired by a big American defense company called Curtiss-Wright a number of years ago, and they make these very kind of specialist I think they're called accelerometers or something like that. They're a very specific item for basically making missiles more efficient and measuring like their performance and things like that. And what the ditch found was that those were being shipped to Elbit Systems in Israel.
Good old Elbit Systems.
Yeah, it's always Elbit. And more specifically, they were being shipped to an Elbit subsidiary called IMI Systems, which used to be known as Israel Military Industries, and specifically to their factory in Ramat Hasharon, which is where all the kind of really serious stuff is made, like artillery equipment that's deployed, like in Gaza, and they've been shipping these over certainly from 2023 at least until December last year.
December 2025.
Yeah.
Right.
And they've never commented. They've been obviously contacted for comment on each occasion, and they don't comment.
Accra Control is itself a subsidiary of an American firm.
Curtiss-Wright, yeah. And they, I think this now is like, could be the second time that they've been targeted by Palestine Action Era.
Yeah, so the Ditch acquired video and a statement from Palestine Action Era that shows actionists damaging air conditioning and ventilation equipment at the site in Clonskee in Dublin, and a quote from Palestine Action Era saying, "We have no hope in appealing to the morality of either the Irish government or these weapons manufacturers, as if they had any semblance of a moral conscience, they would have already taken meaningful action against the genocidal states of Israel and the US. We tried peacefully protesting, we tried email and phone campaigns, we tried signing petitions, and none of it worked. History teaches us, in times like these, escalations of tactics are necessary to ensure our voices are heard. The time for symbolic action is over."
Yeah, I mean, they, I guess they're frustrated by, the legal system. And like we've kind of seen over the past 2.5 years that there have been virtually no consequences for Israel or for anybody supplying them. And, one of the complaints would be that a lot of the international organizations that, while their work is very well-meaning, is it actually producing anything concrete? We've really seen nothing. Like, nobody has been prosecuted. Nobody has been, nobody has been prevented from sending military goods to supply Israel with military goods. And, I guess organizations like Palestine Action Era think that, the only way to actually do something about what's happening is to take direct action. And I'm sure that seems to be their position,
We'll move on, I think, we'll stay within the general theme, I think, of arms companies and weapons systems. So, we'll move on to the kind of the slot that looks at non-ditch media. And I suppose this week we had picked out a piece in the Irish Times. It's kind of two pieces that fold into one in a way. So there was a publication on the 15th of May and then on the 16th of May.
A kind of a news version and then a more features version of a similar story, yeah.
Yeah, so both pieces are by Conor Gallagher in the Irish Times. And so the longer piece is called "Robots in the Military, How the Defence Forces is Using AI to Cover Shortfalls in Resources and Personnel." So maybe to take the piece in two parts. So kind of the first part looks at, this system which is called C-SCAN. And so C-SCAN is a system that is it's a pilot scheme that's being rolled out. It's being produced by researchers at Trinity College Dublin in conjunction with the Irish Defence Forces, the Department of Defence. That's kind of the funding behind it. And the idea is that C-SCAN will be used so we constantly hear that the Irish Navy can't put to sea its ships because there's a gap in human resources. And so they're now exploring how they might actually use AI decision-making in order to kind of cover or fill in that gap.
AI analysis, in effect, of things seen out on the sea.
Yeah, so the way the C-SCAN works, and it's now being tested and piloted, and that's kind of laid out in the article. So it uses this acoustic censoring methodology that they've developed, where they will send acoustic sensory waves along undersea cables, and they will gather data which will detect. And the story that Conor Gallagher is talking about is that there is an Irish naval ship that is above the undersea cables that they are using this pilot technology on, and it sends it manages to make a digital image of the ship. So the system works by sending sensory waves to gather data. That data is then fed into an AI algorithm, which will basically it will be instructed to receive information, process it, and then generate an outcome. And the outcome will be that there is a ship in the region, or that there is potentially a threat in the region.
Right,
So,
and that would mean even a ship that had turned off its other equipment and wasn't being detected on normal radar, a ship that's gone dark, could still be detected using this subsea system.
yeah, so they quote the idea that it would detect, quote, dark vessels.
Right.
Dark vessels at sea could be detected. So
Always
I
assumed
think
to be
it's-
Russian, of course, in the real world.
Yeah, but what's interesting, I think, about this is that there is a decision being taken to rely on the AI. So I suppose who's feeding the information into the algorithms, what kind of questions are being. We don't have that information,
Right.
so it could be that there's. A perfectly legitimate ship that's passing over these cables, but depending on how this AI system is programmed, it may come back with a result that the ship in the region is potentially dangerous.
We've talked a little bit before about this kind of the exaggeration of the threat to the cables story. It's interesting, this particular article, the first half of it is set up as a little bit of a gee whiz, wow, look at this technology that's being used, and isn't this exciting, and the Russians won't get away with this anymore, these threats to our cables. And there's a kind of a little bit of almost an exciting or promotional aspect to the way that the story is framed. You know, there's a lot of, on the online version, there's a lot of graphics and images that show the kinds of sort of detection technology that's being used here.
Yeah, and I suppose that the use of the C-scan as kind of this pilot project that's being rolled out should be understood within the context of another development that's happening that also is mentioned in Conor Gallagher's piece, which is, and we're going back to something we spoke about in a few episodes at the beginning of the podcast series, where we talked about this French arms deal, where the Irish government was in negotiation with the French to purchase a number of vehicles from this program called Scorpion. And the idea was that we would get three particular types of vehicles. Remember, we spoke about the Griffon, the Jaguar, and the Serval. I had said that readers or listeners should look up the show notes to
show
look
notes
at
for
these.
episode 1. You can still see those lovely armored cars and tanks.
Yeah, and so the piece talks about how these particular vehicles that are at the centre of this French arms deal also use AI. And so the thing that ties these two stories together is that the AI systems that are being built into these French vehicles can automatically identify targets and aim at them if they're considered to be a threat. So then if you consider that the Irish government is, on the one hand, through the collaboration with Trinity College Dublin, developing technologies that will send sensories along, acoustic sensory waves along these cables that will detect a threat, and that will use AI. So there's these French vehicles that the Irish government is looking to acquire in the French arms deal, and there's two things that are problematic here. So the first thing is that these vehicles will use AI to automatically identify targets and aim at perceived threats. So that is a gun that will be able to be manoeuvred based on information that is acquired through AI to manoeuvre the gun into position where it is actually able to fire at a perceived threat. So the first is identifying the target, and then these will actually be able to fire. So they will be able to fire automatically on a target without human input.
Right.
Now, the first thing has been used in warfare, and we've seen that, and that connects in with what Roman was saying. In Gaza, we've seen how artificial intelligence has been used. It's been extensively documented. Technologies like Lavender or Where's Daddy, really horrific use of this AI-generated content, where they will then go through all of this data and they will use that to target people in Gaza. Yeah, so the thing is, AI is being used first to identify a target, and then the AI will actually have the capacity to pull the trigger if it wishes. So there is no human in that loop. And I suppose the question here is the decision making. So the Irish government is in the process of potentially making a decision which will see Ireland acquire military equipment, which is already something that is hugely problematic. that's the first thing. But military equipment that is reliant on AI technologies, that's the second thing, which is hugely problematic. We haven't had a conversation in Ireland, first on the acquisition of military equipment, and second on the use of AI more generally. And it's kind of this idea that, the logic that's being used in relation to the C-SCAN system is, well, this is to cover a gap in relation to human resources. And so there's this justification that's being rolled out. And we've all seen how, there's information that we receive from technologies and that we tend to believe that information. So a very simple example is Google Maps. So, for example, I have to go to Tala this evening. I've never been to Tala before. I don't know how to get there. I'm going to rely on the information that Google Maps gives me to make my way to Tala this evening, right? I have no other way of kind of figuring out how to get there besides what Google Maps tells me.
So I can tell you what bus to get.
But so we often have this kind of machine-generated information bias. So why is that problematic? Because if we have a vehicle that is relying on AI information to tell us that this is a target, what are we going to measure that against? And also, this is something that will happen in a matter of seconds. You're inside in a tank, for example, and you get information that is generated by an AI algorithm that is telling you, this is a legitimate target, you should shoot this target. And, you're the human in the loop then, and you can press the button to fire that weapon,
right,
or not. But you're more likely to do so, and there's been tests done on this. It's like following Google Maps.
Sure.
You're much more likely to do so if the machine-generated information is telling you to do so.
It's logical somehow to follow the machine, absolutely, exactly as you say. To be fair to this article, Conor Gallagher, in the first part of the article, as we said, there's a little bit of kind of gee whiz about the subsea technology. But the second part of the article does raise some of these ethical questions about the use of AI arising out of the acquisition of these weapons, and talks about the use of AI systems in Gaza. And indeed, it finishes with the famous supposed AI targeting of the girls' school in Iran that started the American attacks on Iran in the current Iran war. So just to be fair to the Irish Times and to Conor Gallagher, the piece does develop some of the critical questions that we're talking about here, that the military in general is giving itself over to a series of systems that we haven't, that have been used, not, as you say, not without a human in the loop, but even with a human in the loop, that result consistently in the targeting of civilians and the mistargeting of people who have no business being the target of military machinery.
Yeah, and I suppose the moment to have the conversation about whether we, become involved as a state in using AI in weapons systems is now and not after the fact, but that conversation isn't happening. It's very much kind of the use of AI is kind of given as this kind of, these systems are smart, they're going to reduce kind of, we won't need as many human resources, or this kind of, that it's an additional, safety net that the system has actually reviewed the content. But we have no guarantees on that. There's no system. Actually, what we've seen when these systems are used is what we know of Gaza, which is, an entire residential block being taken out because the AI generating information has said, well, there's a person of interest in this building, and then the conclusion is to actually demolish the entire building. And we've seen how Israel has argued that that is a proportionate and necessary response to the information that it received in these AI systems. We've seen the normalization of AI technologies in warfare. It's really worrying that Ireland is, there's so many dimensions to the Irish embrace of militarisation that it's concerning, but this idea that we would now be developing these AI technologies on the one hand in Trinity College, which are being which are designed to within this militarized context, and we could have a long conversation about how research at university level is becoming more militarized. That's one dimension, but it's also the idea that why does the Irish government, what are we planning on doing with 600 million euros worth of of vehicles that have the capacity to use AI technologies to shoot at targets, with potentially without a human in the loop. That is taking us down a really, really dangerous road. And just when I was doing, research before on the arms trade, we would often look at kind of the development of warfare in 3 stages. The first stage was the development of gunpowder. Centuries ago when gunpowder was developed, it totally changed the way wars were fought. The second is the development of nuclear weapons. That totally changed the way wars were conducted. And the third is now AI. If we manage to actually, if we allow a situation where we have weapons that are deciding for themselves whether they should, that's not a scenario that's that far away, actually. No. The weapons are capable of doing that, but so far humans have not allowed that to happen. But when will we cross that threshold?
Right. Why don't we put that story aside for the minute, but it actually ties into the conversation that we want to have now, which also returns us to kind of the responsibility of Irish companies and the participation of Irish technology and defense firms in a kind of a global arms trade, and in particular in the Israeli weapons industry. And we are actually, again, to some extent reliant on another story that was published in a different publication this time, a story by Niall Sargent that ran in The Currency last week, revealed Ireland approved 20 million euros in dual-use exports to the IDF and the Israeli Defense Ministry at the height of the Gaza war. That is to say, in 2024, with the war started, as we know, in October of 2023. In 2024, 20 million euro in exports were licensed from Irish companies to the IDF and the Israeli Defense Ministry. Now, the story goes on to talk about the way that there was a reversal in that policy in 2025, so we might get to that. But maybe, Roman, first you might talk to us about this dual-use licensing system and how it plays out in practice.
Yeah, so it's a relatively new piece of European legislation that is incorporated or transposed into Irish domestic law. So it's 2023, and it controls the export of what are known as dual-use goods. Now, the thing about dual-use goods is that invariably they only have one use, and that's military use. Yeah, and I think there's always question marks over whether or not items that are classified as dual use but likely for civilian use are whether that's actually the case, because you have companies like Elbit Systems who have smaller divisions that are engaged in kind of, the development or maintenance of civilian aircraft, but it's quite minor. So I think I think realistically, most of the stuff, certainly that's going to Israel, from Niall Sargent's story, would likely be for military and defence purposes.
And these are specifically going to the IDF and to the Defence Ministry. And we know, we talked earlier about the Aqua Control systems. It's coming from a system, a company here that's a subsidiary of an American defence company. It's going directly into a part of Elbit that is military contractor. So these are clearly systems that are, and as you explained, it's a guidance or part of a control system for missiles. So there's no question about the military use here.
And we've seen as well, the Ditch has reported on other companies like Inna Labs, which are based in North Dublin, and they are supplying what appear to be drone parts to Elbit Systems. So there are several Irish companies, and I'm sure there are plenty more that are supplying Elbit Systems. And I think the incredible part about Niall Sargent's story is that these are supposedly dual use goods going directly to the Israeli Ministry of Defense and or the IDF, which is honestly incredible. Like when you consider that this was in 2024, so unless all of these licenses were approved, before mid-January 2024, which I think is highly unlikely, then they were approved after the International Court of Justice gave its provisional ruling.
Right.
In
relation to genocide.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that the department saw fit to continue issuing licenses. Now, the interesting thing about that is that, like, the Genocide Convention is incorporated into Irish law, and so is the Rome Statute, which deals with aiding and abetting, essentially, in genocide, or contributing to genocide, which is what the central bank has been alleged to have done in relation to the war bonds. But the interesting thing is that the criminal liability attaches to individuals. So you could, in theory, have a situation where, a criminal complaint, an investigation takes place directly in relation to the individuals that approved those licenses and the Minister for Enterprise himself. Now, I don't think that's unlikely to happen, but that's how serious this is. And I think also what's very interesting is that these licenses are valid for 12 months. So, for example, we know that Accra Control sent their dual-use items in December last year, December 2025. We presume that was done under a license issued by the Department of Enterprise, and that would suggest that licenses were being issued up until December 2024,
right,
and that companies have been able to use them up until 6 months ago, which I think at that point well over 50,000 civilians had been killed by the Israeli forces.
Just to be clear, what Niall Sargent's story suggests is that there was a reversal of policy within the Department of Enterprise and Trade in 2025 that resulted in licenses being refused.
Yeah.
And there's some heavily redacted documents, but some documents that indicate that they were telling companies that because of the human rights situation in Israel, that they couldn't approve these licenses. So what we're suggesting here is that there was a change of policy by the Irish government in 2025 in issuing these licenses, but that licenses issued earlier seem to have still been in effect in 2025, allowing, for example, these Accra Control devices.
And well, you see, the other problem as well is that it doesn't seem to be the case that dual-use items that are being exported to private companies like Elbit Systems in Israel, it's not clear how those are categorized. They're probably not categorized as Ministry of Defense purchases. So are they still being allowed?
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Because Elbit Systems, what we've seen is that Elbit Systems often, and we've seen this on invoices, will take receipt of items more or less on behalf of the Israeli Defense Forces.
Right. So this may only be a small part of a bigger picture that we're seeing here.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a great story by Niall Sargent in The Currency, but it's very worthwhile to read it alongside the Ditch's ongoing coverage of these shipments to understand, first of all, who the companies involved are, what the systems are. A lot of that stuff is redacted in the documents that Niall Sargent was able to obtain. But because of what we know through the Ditch's work, we can actually fit pieces of the puzzle together.
Yeah. I mean, there's this very slow kind of piecing together, as you said, of trying to figure out what exactly is going on and putting together all these kind of nuggets of information to get a picture on the level of Ireland's complicity in terms of supplying Israel and Israeli arms manufacturers with all of these components that are being made in Ireland. And there are plenty of other companies. The Ditch has reported on analog devices in Limerick that they've been sending components to Elbit Systems as well. And I think that's only scratching the surface. Yeah. I think there are plenty of other companies that haven't been exposed. And there are plenty of companies that are manufacturing, far more kind of serious kind of defence items in Ireland that might be being shipped to Israel, and we don't know about it,
Yeah, I mean, Niall Sargent, I think, said on social media that it was 18 months' work, FOI requests, etc., involved in this story alone. But there, as you say, there's more.
Yeah, and maybe just on one of the quotes from Niall Sargent's piece in relation to the company. So he get in some of the information he gets back from the department, from the spokesperson, says that the companies cannot be disclosed. They're redacted in the documents. And it says because it could, this is a quote, could commercially disadvantage the exporter. So that, the importance is, and that it's kind of rolled out again in another quote, is that the purpose, this is a quote, the purpose is not to block trade, but to ensure free movement of legitimate goods, ensuring that certain sensitive categories are subject to appropriate regulation. So again, you see the prioritization is economics, is business, is export, and not, the livelihoods, the lives of Palestinian people. And just maybe picking up on Roman when you said a little bit about the criteria that was being used, another quote from the piece is that the person in the department who is signing off, because all of these exports, they're all, the licenses, they're all signed off either by the minister or somebody acting on the minister's behalf, and they will have to consider, again a quote, consider the nature of the items, the destination country, Israel, the end user, which is mentioned as the IDF or the Ministry of Defence in Israel, the regional stability. At this point we have, the ICJ saying there's a plausible case of genocide, and human rights concerns, again, plausible case of genocide. So it's, how could you possibly be sitting in the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment having to look at this criteria, what the items are, the destination country, the end user, the regional stability and the human rights concerns, looking at these 5 criteria and decide this is okay. I can, sign off on this piece of equipment being sent to Israel, and I have no concerns about that. I mean, yeah. It is impossible.
I specifically spoke about this issue in, I was on a panel last year with the Palestinian ambassador, a few union people, and Catherine Connolly as well before she was elected president. And it was organised by Forza Youth, the trade union, and I essentially asked where are the unions, and I specifically mentioned export licenses for dual-use goods. So it does beg the question, where are the unions? Why are the unions not issuing directives to their members that work within the Department of Enterprise to say don't issue these licenses. You need to refuse to issue these licenses and have a policy on it.
Yeah.
But I think they've been a lot of the unions have been to be quite honest, useless when it comes to any sort of stuff like that. Same at Shannon Airport, just complete silence.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's another quote.
Not from the members, I should say. Sorry, but from senior management within the unions.
That's right. Yeah.
And maybe just in the piece, because it does kind of question, well, how is it that these licenses were being approved in 2024 and then they stopped in 2025? And they speak to somebody who looks at, arms exports and is anti-arms trade. I can't remember the person's name, but they kind of talk about, well, refusing licenses in 2025, while it's welcome, it's, the horse has already bolted. It's a bit like, I think the quote was, closing the stable door after the horse is bolted. So, there needs to be accountability for that.
Yeah, and as we've suggested, that with the licenses lasting for a year, licenses that were issued in 2024 continued to be operative in 2025. And as also, Roman, as you pointed out, we just don't know to what extent these licenses are actually covering the technologies that may still be going and in use. So we still have an awful lot to learn about this. And the story that we've got here has, to some extent, offers some credit or some credibility to the Irish government in terms of what does appear to have been a change in policy, perhaps coinciding with the Taoiseach's first mention of the word genocide early in 2025 in relation to what was going on in Gaza, that might have been the point at which the government took a different stance. But we don't know to what extent that stance has actually had an effect down the line, and to what extent it is actually restricting the use of these technologies and these devices and these products in both in Gaza, in the West Bank, and elsewhere.
Yeah. I think, like, if you consider the fact that, as you pointed out, it took Niall 18 months, like, to get into those documents, hopefully it's just the start of kind of uncovering, and hopefully as well, like, mainstream media starts to do their part as well, because I think, like, it's kind of fair to say that it's really just the Ditch and Niall Sargent that have kind of been tipping away at this for the past kind of 2 years. And, as you said, like, we don't really know the full extent of it. And, as Niamh pointed out, like, we have the commercial interests of these companies being put ahead of, like, the public's right to know what's being exported, who are the companies that are exporting this.
The Department of Enterprise is the one issuing these licenses effectively on behalf of Irish business.
Yeah, and I suppose as this information comes out and as we uncover another layer of Irish complicity in genocide, it will become, more difficult for the government to, on the one hand, go before the International Court of Justice and argue that Israel is committing a genocide, because that is what the government is doing. It's formally backing South Africa's case against Israel for the perpetration of a genocide. Ireland will back that case formally at the ICJ and argue as such, while at the same time, in Ireland, government departments, whether it's the Department of Transport approving Israeli overflights, or whether it's the Department of Enterprise approving the export of military use goods or dual use goods to Israel, those two positions are incompatible. That on the one hand you argue a genocide is taking place, and on the other hand you maintain relations with that country and you export equipment that is being used to perpetrate that genocide.
Can we maybe talk about the larger European context to finish up here, Niamh, because I know it's an area that you specialize in, obviously. And we saw another story that we did have a brief look at this week was in the Financial Times. NATO calls on EU countries to step up their defense spending. So this is all happening in the context of a larger picture in which international bodies, major institutions, are all pushing these industries forward and wanting to see more of this kind of development, more of this kind of trade, more of this kind of manufacturing.
Yeah, I suppose one of the areas I had looked at before coming in today was the EU's AI Act. So the European Union rolled out with great fanfare the Artificial Intelligence Act. I think it came into law in 2024, but it's really important to mention that it actually exempts any use of AI that has a military defence or national security end, that is actually exempt from the European Union's AI Act.
So the AI Act, which restricts the use of AI,
which regulates. So so the AI Act is designed to regulate the use of AI in the European Union, but it specifically exempts any use that is classified as military defence or national security purposes. There we had an opportunity to regulate the use of AI in military equipment. We didn't do so at European Union level. And that it's just one more example of how the arms companies are really calling the shots. And if you look at, you can go on and look at the French company, the Scorpion program that is being rolled out, and back around again to talking about the vehicles. But they talk about, optimization, modernization, new information systems. It's all been presented with great fanfare, and that's the context in Europe. It's NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is meeting with all of the kind of leading arms companies around Europe ahead of the NATO summit in Ankara this summer to get them on board for more military spending. And of course the companies are on board. They're driving the spending as well as benefiting from it because they tap into then public money. Another thing we could talk about, we could be here all day. Another thing we looked at a few years back in Transnational Institute was the use of the European Union public money, so pilot schemes within the European Union where they were actually funding the research and development of weapons that relied on AI systems. And then we had the European Defence Fund, which took that to a whole other level. And one of the pieces of equipment that Roman mentioned was the laser guns. And the European Union was funding these kind of research and development of these laser gun technologies where, they are invisible in many cases, they're silent, and they're often used with AI technologies, and they can be used to kill people. So that's, our public money being used to fund equipment, military equipment that has AI systems built into them. And this is only the start. If it already feels in a way like the horse has bolted on this question. And like I said, a missed opportunity with the AI Act to actually regulate this. So here we are. And Ireland, unfortunately, instead of getting ahead of things and saying, no, we are not going to buy equipment that relies on AI, or we're not going to use it, Ireland is considers this as an opportunity. And that quote from the department on how we will prioritise the capacity for a company to trade, that's where our priorities lie.
Absolutely. So while on the one hand we've seen a kind of a small gesture in terms of restricting shipments of some dual-use weapons directly to the Israeli military, we're seeing that in a larger context of the state and the government viewing it as a very much a positive development, that Irish companies are part of a global rush to develop new weapons technologies.
Yeah.
And on that sad note, we might leave it there for today, guys. We'll call it a podcast. But I think you definitely have to keep watching The Ditch. Also, Niall Sargent in the Currency, in fairness, but also we keep an eye on The Ditch to see how this story plays out, because it is one of the very few places where we're seeing coverage of these kinds of developments in both in the global and in the Irish environment. Thank you very much, Roman.
Yeah, thanks, Roman, for coming in.
You can shout down the party line by emailing theditchpartyline@gmail.com. Keep up with The Ditch in their WhatsApp group on theditch.com, and please do support The Ditch, not only by going along and reading its stories and following its social media, but with a donation or a subscription at the website. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.